My concern slightly shifted, and then the cultural transition in my work in India, and later I also did work in England, Italy, and even in Abu Dhabi, was to sort of confront culture and with nature more and more, and this impossible gap and conflict. You know, having grown up with works of art around me, and then feeling quite constricted at the same time too. I mean, only later did I really appreciate that. At first, when you're young, you know, you're with these beautiful objects. You can't bring friends around to run around in the house, right? It becomes a bit precious. So those furnishings, I later realized, you know, the repetition of them throughout Belgravia. Then later, when I visited gentlemen's clubs, again, these world-class museum paintings by Reynolds, by Stubbs, by, you know, the great painters of Britain were in these clubs for private members, not open to the public. I found that rather extraordinary. How can, you know, this is like museum, what is it? So it made me start reflecting on the nature of property. Of course, Belgravia already had done that too. Patrimony, heritage, nationhood, the way the ideological state apparatus, let's say, uses this culture to put a message out, sort of like propaganda, really, about itself and how wonderful its culture is, superior, of course, to everybody else, especially if one thought about the British imperialist position. They're always superior to everybody else. So I was quite fascinated by that power that one could harness in culture to put out those messages. And what I wanted to do was to really challenge and undermine them by parody, humor, etc. So Connoisseurs followed Gentlemen, and with plaques on the frame. You have them in the gallery right now. And they are parodying received ideas on culture that I came across as I read about the forming of the Royal Academy. They playfully reiterate those rules and conventions. Sometimes they point out something else, like one image which isn't here, which is on the cover of my Thames and Hudson book, which an early publication of my work, The Genius of the Place. I would bring in and add objects to the museum or to the house. And in the UK, it's very much the house, the country house structure, which formed the gentlemen clubs, rooms and buildings, but also they were the early museums before public museums. So I decided that I would photograph those heritage houses, like Chiswick House appears in Connoisseurs, so does Osterley Park House. That's a very important sort of sense of these early houses were the gentlemen that I found in gentlemen's clubs. Particularly the 18th century version. The club was formed first as a coffee house where educated men only could debate politics over coffee, yeah? So coffee kept people away, so long discuss. So these clubs, these men had beautiful country houses, some of them, and those country houses were the ones that type of country houses that I photographed in Connoisseurs. So one series led to another. There were threads to do with culture, in paintings, objects of art, some of the ideas under pinning these objects that I examined in Connoisseurs. And then later in Academies, I was looking at the reproduction of ideas through education and how that connected to museum culture, and how to also in ways try to subvert that. So for example, one image in here, movement of the soul, is a friend of mine, caressing a white canvas statue. You're not allowed to touch artworks in a museum. So there were these gestures that I was bringing into the work, as well as objects that were troubling or disrupting the space, the museum space. People approached me to make work when I was doing Academies, and I did this set of about 6 photographs in the Musée d'Orsay called, used to call it The Visitors, like a chapter in Academies, and went to Desrolles, the famous Parisian taxidermy shop, where also people like Dali got their lobsters. The surrealists has been around for a while, and rented monkeys of all different types, apes and monkeys, which I then introduced to the Musée d'Orsay, to the 19th century sculpture collection, and made a series of very popular works, making fun of, the curators, the museum, sort of apparatus there. And then realizing how of course, over time, when you're introducing objects, like in Connoisseurs, the contemplation of the essential forms, or the 4 Platonic forms, which I made and brought in, is that it's a way of creating a dialogue reflection on the museum collection itself, on the relationship that the spectator has to the image, and disrupting, again, this very transparent space of realism, as much as challenging some of the elements of the museum collection. So the use of the animal initially in the museum for me was really confronting one collection in front of another one, right? So adding and changing the museum collection in that moment of photography. There is then the changing situation of photography. It's going more and more from analog to digital. Initially, in some of my early work, which isn't here, Capital, for example, I have digitized a Mickey Mouse standing in front of the Bank of England, and it says "The End of History." There's an example of where I'm beginning to digitize and use the montage strategy that I'm developing in my later photography, but I've rehearsed in my earlier photography by bringing in objects and elements. So there's a transition that takes place in Fables, which from analog, I'm using 5:4 photography to frame the space. So so in a way, I continue doing that even in India Song, where all the animals are live. I've become a wildlife photographer, essentially, because I'm finding that the taxidermized animals are just not satisfying enough. And I also then wanted to bring in something around, which was beginning in my Wallace collection work, in that which was called Sanctuary, this idea of climate change and this idea of fragility in both the buildings in India and the wildlife. So my concern slightly shifted, and then the cultural transition in my work in India, and later I also did work in England, Italy, and even in Abu Dhabi, was to sort of confront culture and with nature more and more, and this impossible gap and conflict. It sounds like a cliche, but it must be true, is that when you teach, you learn, you're learning, you're finding out, The students over the years have taught me as much as I've taught them. When I don't know something, I ask a student, I ask a younger person. I don't have any problems with doing that. And also it's just feeling this continuity and giving giving back. At first, teaching was an economic imperative. You know, I was always teaching half-time, as many women teach because of the child. But somehow I was lucky enough to be able to have the mental space and energy to make work after putting the child to bed, you know, doing all those chores, those everyday chores, was quite tiring. But to have that drive to keep making work and showing. There are different ways of being a photographer. There are so many ways now that have opened up. There's so many different ways of working in photography that include not even taking a photograph. The notion of photography has expanded and changed. I think the advice I would give is experiment, focus, learn how to look, to really take your time looking, research, persevere, be stubborn, just keep doing it. Just keep doing it until you're good at it. You're not naturally good at anything. Even on an iPhone now, people can take photographs. You still have to take time to think and frame properly. There's so many, it's so flexible, photography now. I mean, I photograph now with my iPhone, you know, to do test shots. Some of my phone works are also now part of my road trip project with Anna Fox. I'm doing another collaborative project that I'm finishing off using iPhone, using you know, digital SLR cameras, and using the phase, and also using 5.4. You know, be experimental, you know, work with other people, share your ideas, get together with a group, and it's easier to raise money like that to survive. Get into, you know, with your friends, a studio, help each other out. Keep on not taking all the credit, but also giving other people the credit for either helping you make work, or other photographers that you admire. Talk about them openly. If there's too little black photographers, especially black women photographers, find them, cultivate them, mention them, give them space and visibility. And, you know, share the space, really, is really important. But really, you need to be very, very stubborn and continue making work all the time. My point in life is about giving back and, you know, mentoring, nurturing new talent in photography, because now I will be leaving my professorship, but I still want to be active within the institution in other ways. You know, I won't be teaching after this year, and want to focus on my archive and my work. And maybe if everything works out, maybe setting up a trust for emerging women in photography. Let's see, linked to Fast Forward in Photography, which is a research group that Anna Fox and I started after having this conversation. Well, we have 60–70% women on our courses. What's happened to them? And where are the black photographers, and where are, you know, now the non-binary, or the, you know, where are they? Why aren't, you know, they need to be supported. So that's now what I'm focusing on, as well as making new work.